Anxiety is an alarm in your body, but it is an alarm that's signaling what? It's signaling that the little you feels separate. And I got to tell you something, that insight that it's an alarm for moments when you feel separate, that has been huge for me. And it has changed how I deal with moments where I feel anxious. Let's listen to Dr. Russell Kennedy talk about it. What is your definition of anxiety, Dr. Kennedy?
Anxiety for me is anxious thoughts of the mind. Anxiety is not painful itself. What's painful is this sense of alarm that's in our body, that's in our system. And it's the alarm that drives the thoughts because it's a very atypical way, especially as a doctor and a neuroscientist, to look at anxiety as more as a body issue, like old
Mm,
unresolved wounding that just making sense through the mind because the mind is this compulsive meaning making make sense machine. So when it feels the alarm in your body from the old wounds that haven't been resolved, it makes sense of it by worrying, warnings, what ifs, worst case scenarios, and that's what happens.
okay. Where does anxiety come from?
It comes from that alarm in your body because typically what happens with people with chronic anxiety is normal. Anxiety over taxes, anxiety over your kids, that's normal. But if it's every day, if it's relentless, like that kind of anxiety is abnormal. That typically comes from sort of unresolved stuff from your childhood, and it's stuck in your body and in your mind to some extent. It's a tough call because when you say anxiety is in your body, of course it's in your nervous system, which of course is your body and your mind. So it's really finding that place of unresolved wounding, that trauma that still sits in you, because that's the engine of what's driving your thoughts. So rather than thinking of anxiety as a thought-based process, it's actually a feeling-based process that's only kind of reflected by the mind. But we assume that it's the mind because we're so fixated on the mind in our society. So it's really a body-based issue, but we focus on the mind and we try and fix it through the mind. And that's why people are in therapy for 30 years and they're not getting a lot better.
I've spent the better part of my lifetime living with all of this unrest
Me
and
too.
unease and on edgeness in my body. And I have tried for decades to make sense of it, to calm it, to soothe it, to heal it through my mind. And it is a revelation to realize, whoa, it really starts with thinking about the body. How do you know if what you're experiencing in your life right now is anxiety versus just day to day stress versus overwhelm?
I think if it's chronic, like if you're looking at your life, if you wake up in the morning and you're going, oh my God, I've got this, and this, which you talked about before on the podcast, like waking up with this sense of dread, that's a sign that things aren't quite right. I think that we live in our minds, we live in our bodies. This just becomes normal. And unless it rises above this kind of critical mass where we're like uncomfortable almost all the time, then we think, well, there's something going on. And now with Instagram, with all this stuff, like everything's trauma. Everything's trauma. And I watched your episode about healing childhood trauma, and I really want to dive into that as well because it's so important. Because the quick version is you probably had trauma as a child that was unresolvable for you as a child. Now, what happens is when we get trauma as children, we blame ourselves. There's a great saying that says if you abuse, neglect, or abandon a child, the child doesn't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves. And then that
Mm.
starts the split. And then we start judging, abandoning, blaming, and shaming ourselves from that point forward. And that split causes this sense of alarm that gets lodged in our body. And then because we don't want to feel that alarm in our body, we go up into our heads, which is the only place that a child can go because they're pretty powerless in their environment, and they overthink. And that's a temporary escape. And then we train ourselves as children to overthink because that's the only safe places in our minds. And then when we get older, go through a couple divorces, you get in a car accident, whatever, that stuff tends to come right back up again. So that's really the basis of where this global anxiety kind of comes from in people is it's this unresolved trauma, and your parents love you and you've got a supportive family and you're attuned and connected and quote unquote securely attached. You can go through traumas like we all do in childhood, and they won't impact your nervous system to create this permanent change. Or I don't like using the word permanent because it makes it feel like it's hopeless, but it creates a permanent change in your nervous system. And trauma is anything that changes your nervous system, that stucks your nervous system in a pattern that doesn't allow you to get out of that trauma. And then we just get into this loop where there's alarm in our body. We make sense of it by making horrible thoughts in our mind, warnings, what ifs, worst case scenarios, which of course makes the alarm of the body worse, which of course makes the thoughts worse. And we get caught in this alarm anxiety cycle. And unless we see it, we can't get out of it.